The President, please be seated. The court is now back in session. We continue hearing the testimonies from Mr. David Chandler. The questions continue to be put by counsel for Mr. Nongji. You may now proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. Professor Chandler, before the break we were speaking about the American bombardments, and you have provided some information with regard to these bombardments. But in your Brother number 1 book, you state, and I am happy to put it on the screen, but I will try if I can just quote the language and you can respond to it. The bombing campaign's effect on rural society is difficult to judge, but in view of the tonnage involved in Cambodia's unpreparedness, it must have been catastrophic. And then you, well, let me first ask you to respond to that. What would you say if you were asked about the effects of the bombing on Cambodia's rural society?
Well, that sentence, of course, which I stand by in the sense that I stand by what I wrote in 1991. Now, since that time, I've come back to Cambodia many times, and I'm sure the effect of the bombing in many rural areas, was indeed catastrophic. But it doesn't seem to feature as much as one might have thought it would in many of the survivors' statements and witness statements at the court and other things. It looks to me as if a lot of the tonnage was not dropped intentionally on unpopulated areas, but did fall on unpopulated areas. We read in many of the reports about the punishment centers around the country that a lot of times victims were thrown into B-52 craters, which were dotted the countryside. I think I would still stick by that sentence, but I want to say there's 20 more years of people being able to come forward and say this is the worst thing that happened, and that they haven't come forward to say that. Which isn't to say that occasionally, or maybe even often, villages were destroyed. I think the primary effect of this bombing was the forced exodus from the countryside, especially around Phnom Penh, into Phnom Penh for take refuge. You look at the map of the bombing that was before this increased tonnage figure was available in Shawcross's book, Sideshow. It's a ring of fire around the capital. It's around provinces around the capital. Obviously, would have thrown people into the city, I would think, rather than families into the revolution. Certainly some young men, either enraged by the bombardment or for other reasons, joined the Khmer Rouge at this time, but we don't have the precise evidence of the quantity of these recruits at that time, or that this might be a result of the bombing.
Sorry to interrupt you, and I truly find it very fascinating, the things you're saying here today, and also, by the way, the things you've written in all your books. But time is short, so I sometimes have to interrupt, and you actually have touched on the next topic that I wanted to ask a question on. That was as you called it, the forced exodus of people from the countryside. It's a matter of words, but would you agree, Professor Chandler, that the bombing, in that sense, created a stream of refugees that were fleeing towards Phnom Penh, into Phnom Penh?
Certainly. There's a brief answer for you.
And do you have an estimate as to the number of refugees that had fled to Phnom Penh by 1973, or at the end of 1973, because of the American bombings, and perhaps the effects lasted longer into 74 or 75, but that's for you to answer.
What we know for sure, and it isn't really for sure either, is that the size of Phnom Penh in April 75 has been estimated between 2 and 2.5 million people. This was not the size of the city in 1970, 71, where it was maybe 500,000. So we don't know when those extra people, if you like, I don't mean to demean them at all, came into the city or what their reasons were. You have to assume, I think, that at least a proportion of them came from nearby provinces fleeing the bombing, but I'm not able to say what kind of percentage this might be. There's never been any work on this kind of data.
And are you able to tell us something about the living conditions in Phnom Penh in April 1975 before the Khmer Rouge took over?
Only from secondary sources and interviews I've conducted, but they were pretty horrendous. The town was jammed with people who did not have enough to eat or sanitary conditions to live under. This has been heavily reported in many sources.
And that leads me into the next topic, and that is the evacuation of Phnom Penh after the DK forces moved into the city. And you have stated last week on July 19th on the transcript, pages 73 to 75, and I quote, "When they were approached by outsiders, they often came up with other reasons, which I think were also valid. There's a bunch of reasons. I'm not saying that the shortage of food was bad or the fear of an American attack. There's lots of ones that were mentioned." End of quote. And to be clear for the people that are attending these proceedings today and that were not present last week, we're talking about the reasons the leadership of the DK regime gave for the evacuation of Phnom Penh. So you state that you're not saying that the shortage of food was bad or the fear of an American attack. And I would like to focus just for now on that last point, the fear for an American attack. You're saying that you're not saying that the fear of an American attack was not a valid reason. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I don't think it's an explanation that may have been given and what seemed to have been given at the time to some people in the city, but the Americans had gone and were not going to come back. I think the regime may have known that. When the decision was made to evacuate the cities in February 1975, as we've seen, this was never given as one of the main reasons. Seems to be the city had to be evacuated for reasons that the regime decided on, backed up by practical points that make it seem more humanitarian. But there really wasn't food in the city to feed these 2 million people unless they took outside aid, which they refused to do. And it was a wartime situation, and they had built up as I said, a huge reservoir of hatred of city people among their own followers. But I think the renewed American raids, and I don't have access to the thinking of American regime at this time, but I think I can say with pretty much assurance there was no plan to bomb Phnom Penh at the event of after the Khmer Rouge victory. Certainly no documents have ever surfaced that anything like that as a policy procedure.
I don't mean for you to speculate on the American intentions in the line of this questioning. But speaking about this food situation that you referenced, and you've stated there was not enough food to eat in Phnom Penh, in your book, A History of Cambodia, you state, and we have looked at the passage last week, so if we can just quote the page in that book, and I'm very happy to provide a hard copy to you and provide it on the screen, but for now, let me read the quote, and the quote is, "Conditions were severe, particularly for those unaccustomed to physical labor, but because in most districts there was enough to eat, many survivors of DK who had been evacuated from Phnom Penh came to look back on these months as a comparative golden age." End of quote. And this speaks about the people that were evacuated from Phnom Penh to the countryside. And you write in this passage that in most districts there was enough to eat at that time. Could you elaborate briefly on this comment?
Only in the sense that I assume the people I've spoken to, that other people have spoken to, were telling the truth. I don't think you can invent a pleasant period of your past. If it was unpleasant, they'd say so. They went to the countryside and there was enough to eat. Not very much. They complained that it was not really enough, but it was certainly not starvation and certainly not the kind of terrible restrictions that many of them had enjoyed en route to their destinations, to their perhaps villages where relatives lived or whatever, into a countryside that did have some rice stored. This was not a harvest season. There was not a lot in storage, but they felt, many of the survivors whose testimony we have, felt that these first few months were not as bad as the Exodus itself, and if they were people who were later relocated into the Northwest particularly, was not as bad as what followed.
Thank you. And then if we look at that period after the evacuation, and we are, I would like to discuss a conference that allegedly took place on May 20, 1975. And I'm mentioning this conference because our colleague for the civil parties last Friday asked you some questions relating to this conference, but I am not sure if you were listening to the English translation, but in the English translation it was made to appear that in this conference certain decisions were adopted, and that the civil party lawyer asked you to confirm whether these decisions were in conformity with Khmer Rouge policies. I want to make clear for the record that the document we were looking at, document 4.26, is actually a Ben Kiernan. It's a passage from Ben Kiernan's book, and it's the book The Pol Pot Regime, and it's not actually a document, a DK era document that was discussed. So I first of all I want to make that clear to make sure that you know that we're not talking about a DK era document. Professor Chandler, based on your research, do you know which meeting is meant when we are talking about a May 20, 1975 conference?
I don't think I've referred to it. I think Ben Kiernan, when he did his research, was told this information by people who'd been at the meeting. He never saw any documents, so I would have to be reporting third hand. I'm not sure that I referred to this meeting. I think I'm pretty sure that what he found out from the people who'd been there was accurate. I don't think any reason for them to make it up, but I confirm it's certainly not a document from the Khmer Rouge period that has survived.
Indeed, Professor Chandler, Ben Kiernan himself states in his book on ERN 0010425, it's the English ERN, that, and I quote, no documents and very few members of its audience appear to have survived. End of quote. So that is consistent with what you just told me. Could you, from memory, and I understand you have not prepared for this, but could you name any of those persons in the audience that may have attended this meeting?
I can stand corrected, but I know.
President, Mr. Expert, please hold. There is an objection from the political lawyer. You may proceed.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thank you, Mr. President. I did have an objection. The way this question is worded is going to lead to an answer in the shape of an assumption.
I am happy to rephrase the question to the following. Based on your research, Professor Chandler, can you research into primary decay sources and or secondary sources such as scholarly literature? Can you name any of the persons from the audience, the very few members of its audience that may have survived, that attended this meeting?
I'm almost certain from memory that the person he spoke to might have been Henk Zimmerman himself. I don't think that was a person who was at the meeting. It might have been GSM, but it was one of the people who were top officials in the PRK who told Ben Kiernan, who arrived in the country very early, and it was a very favorite guest. They would I think some of the material that he obtained was invaluable because it was so close to the era, and it is just factual. It's not anything that puts these people in a bad light or whatever. So I think it was Henk Zimmerman, but just remembering from the book, but I'm not sure. Or was one of the people, in other words, person who told Ben about the meeting.
In fact, the 8 points that were discussed by our colleague for the civil parties on Friday were not had as source a certain Sin Song, and this person, Sin Song, did not attend that meeting in person, but had heard it from one of his superiors. So, just for the record, the 8 points that were discussed by the civil party lawyer were related to Ben Kiernan by this certain Sin Song. And as the civil party lawyer discussed on Friday, or mentioned on Friday, that under point 5 of the issues that were allegedly discussed at this meeting was the execution of all leaders of the Lon Nol regime, beginning with the top leaders. And you yourself, in response to these comments, you said that the level to which Lon Nol officers were executed has never been entirely clear. Could you expand on that particular comment that you made as to that the level to which Lon Nol officers were executed has never been entirely clear?
Well, I mean, direct answer to your question is it's not entirely clear because we don't have clear evidence, but certainly the people who were running the country at the last moment, they sort of, I forget what they were called, the villainous 6 or 7 people, including Surik Matak and Longboret and some of these other people, Lon Nol's brother, and so on, were executed at the spot, and this has come up in open reports. Directions have been also survived in documents saying that certainly high-ranking military officials, I think, probably going, that may be an exact here, but I think including all commissioned officers would be smashed, and obviously, as this was happening, people who belonged at all in the chaotic the chaotic conditions of April of '75, some of these people did not draw the line between a commissioned officer and a non-commissioned officer. I think, no, the evidence is unclear, but let me put it this way, very few senior officers of the Lon Nol Army are known to have survived and be among the refugees in other countries. A few have, but they had to be extremely adroit to escape notice and assassination.
Thank you for that clarification. I would like to read to you a quote from the Ben Kiernan article, and if we can produce it on the screen. It is the document that was used by the civil parties last week on Friday, and we saw the Khmer version on the screen. I would like the professor, for obvious reasons, to read the English version. So I would like to hand the professor a hard copy, and the document that I want to display is document number IS 4.26, and it has been used by civil parties on Friday, and it's actually been mentioned on the prosecution's list for documents to be admitted for trial. So with your permission, I would like to show an excerpt of Ben Kiernan's book, The Pol Pot Regime, on page 57. Shall I hand a hard copy to the professor? It's in English. It's the actual book by Ben Kiernan, so it might be easier for the professor to read.
Dear President, yes, you may proceed. Court officer, could you deliver the hard copy document from the council for the expert examination?
And I'm not going through the entirety of that page, but let me, before I actually read the full quote, summarize what's on the left page, which is page 56. On that page, Ben Kiernan writes that indeed Chea Sim confirms Sin Song's list, and Chea Sim allegedly added in that interview, this was a very important order to kill. And Chea Sim also states that it was Nguyen Chia who spoke these words. Another participant of that meeting, and your memory, or your research served you right, was indeed Heng Samrin. And according to Ben Kiernan at least, Heng Samrin had a importantly different reading of the facts. And here I come to the quotation on page 57, and it's the paragraph that starts with Heng Samrin, and I'll read. Heng Samrin, then studying military affairs under Son Sen, was also at the meeting. He recalls the use of yet another term. They did not say kill. They said scatter the people of the old government. Scatter, or kumchat, them away. Don't allow them to remain in the framework. It does not mean smash, kumtek. Smash means kill, but they used a general word, scatter. Nguyen Chia used this phrase. This appears to be Sin Song's point number 5, though the use of varied euphemisms is an important qualification. End of quote. Professor Chandler, based on your knowledge of the language that was used in these DK-era documents, would you agree with Heng Samrin that the use of the term scatter rather than to smash is relevant when studying this meeting, especially concerning J.S. Sim's adamant statement that this was a very important order to kill. Do you find it an important qualification like Ben Kiernan does?
Well, it's certainly a contradiction of information, and I'm not in a position to say which one I believe. I have no access to the full text of the interviews. I haven't seen that word to scatter used often in Khmer Rouge documents. He may well have used this word, and the memory of the man who says he did might be accurate. It seems to me these two high-ranking officials should have been on the same page, but they don't seem to have been. They have very sharp, differing memories. They obviously weren't in the same room when Ben was interviewing them, but I think it's very interesting that Heng Samrin didn't agree, but I can't prefer his testimony because I'm not in a position to take a side on it. But it would seem to me that a big meeting that included the 5 or 6 the 6 points we're talking about wouldn't have used a slightly more genteel word like scatter, because that was already taking place. They'd been scattered already. That was sent to the countryside. But that's not the word they usually use. They usually use chomliach to the countryside, not scatter.
Okay.
So, I can't take a side on this.
That is perfectly reasonable, Professor Chandler. I'm not asking you to take a side in this instance. And this brings me to the next topic, which is a bit later in time, and it is 1977 that we are speaking about. And I would like to quote from a excerpt from Brother Number One, your own book. And again, it's been discussed, and I will proceed by reading the quote, and if you have questions on the quote, I can provide you with the hard copy. And I quote on page 117 to 118 of Brother Number One. The situation deteriorated in 1977 when thousands more starved to death while others became ineffective because of illness and insufficient food. Reports of these conditions took time to reach the higher organization, and since disagreement with the organization amounted to treason, the reports were never critical of the plan or its framers. Instead, the news transmitted up the line was always good, causing false optimism at the top, even as rice production faltered and rural workers died. End of quote. Well, Professor Chandler, based on your research, was there a practice among subordinates in the DK to shield their superiors from information that their superiors would have found distasteful or problematic?
Yes, I think so. I mean, certainly they were shielding themselves from any criticism, trying to stay safe. There's evidence that they would send seed and consumer rice up the line to show that they're producing surpluses which are not taking place. The regime, I think it's become very clear over the last few days, and also in many sources, had a very crowded work schedule. These people were jammed up with things they had to decide on. And conditions in the countryside, particularly among new people, was rather low on their list of priorities. And this accurate information came to them very slowly. I think Mrs. Heng Tirit went to the countryside and came back with some bad reports, but said to the leadership that this must be the work of traitors rather than the plan. So this is one of the high-ranking people makes this same explanation. So, yeah, I mean, there's shielding all around. Everybody's hiding bad news about themselves from people who would then punish them for this behavior or bad news.
Thank you. I think that answers my question fully, so I can move on to the next topic. And I would like to put up a document from your own work. It's brother number 1, document number E3/17, and I would like to have a brief look at page 160 of that book, and the English ERN for that passage is 00393074. And actually, as I see the passage, it's brief enough and it's been working well, so I will just quote the passage to you. And I quote, "Perhaps 100,000 men and women, and probably more, were executed without trial. In rural areas, most of the killings occurred when young cadre enforced what they understood to be the will of the organization. Some of these executions, perhaps most, were impulsive overreactions." End of quote. On Friday, when preparing these questions, I did not possess Friday's transcript yet, but I will try to paraphrase. You spoke of executions in an ad hoc way and snap decisions by enthusiastic cadre. Can you tell us a little bit about this topic, the what you call impulsive overreactions and snap decisions?
Sure. We now know that probably many more than 100,000 people were executed, and that the system of prisons and executions in the countryside was more heavily documented than I knew at the time. But I still would stand by what I wrote in, I guess it's the second edition, it's 1999, that a great deal of evidence has come down, particularly through interviews, of just the behavior of cadre in villages, impulsive, often mysterious, chaotic, but sometimes quite organized and always cruel, of course, but less impulsive than that. It was only coming from orders from above or whatever. But the passage reflects lots of the information I got from over the years with many, many Cambodian people I interviewed. And certainly I should add, never in the confessions of S21 did I read of someone confessing to impulsive behavior in the provinces. This was not the kind of crime that people confess to.
That indeed was going to be my follow-up question, Professor Chandler, whether you had any knowledge of to what extent the lower downs, so to speak, would report ad hoc decisions and impulsive overreactions to the people in the higher echelons.
No, it wouldn't be in their interest, but I got back to something I said last week, that in, I think, the statutes of the Communist Party, or one of the other documents that we've been consulting, leftist deviation is in quotation marks. Rightist deviation is left as a fact. It's the kind of thing that can be recognized. So over-enthusiastic achievement of revolutionary goals, however vaguely understood, was not systematically punished. The cadre was given, in many cases, if not a free rein, it certainly operated with impunity for those activities. Many of these people came in to S21 later charged with being agents and so on, they didn't confess to impulsive killings. They confessed to systematic wrecking of the program in the countryside. So we know these impulsive things took place, but they're not going to send news up to because the people at the top with it, you're not supposed to be impulsive, but the news never went up there, I would guess. It's not the kind of thing you'd report, I don't think.
Thank you. That's clear. And in that same context, I would like to show you a document, an article by Steve Hedder. The title of the document is Reassessing the Role of Senior Leaders and Local Officials in Democratic Kampuchea Crimes, Cambodian Accountability in Comparative Perspective. And it is document number E190.1.398. The English ERN is 006614552491, and the French ERN is 00792913 to page 950. And I would like to show you an excerpt from page 12 at this point. And that has English ERN 00661466. And we have a hard copy for you available. And with your permission, President, I would like to show this on the screen.
The President, Council, with regard to this document, is it placed in the case file already or not yet?
Mr. President, as far as I'm aware, the prosecution confirmed in an earlier session that this document was indeed named on their list of documents to be put before the case file. And I think also, judging from the document number, that it is part of the documents that were submitted by Kyo Sampan to be put before the chamber. That's what the E190.1.398 number suggests to me. So I do not want to misinform you, but in my best understanding, it should be admissible for these two reasons.
The President, you may proceed. And the court officer is now instructed to take the hard copy of the document to be presented to the witness for examination.
Professor Chandler, those are 3 pages from the same article, and I will now be speaking only about page 12, which should be the first page in your collection. And I will quote Steve Hedder where he speaks about killings. And I quote, "But other killings, probably most, were committed by regional and local authorities acting not as part of such a tight chain of command, but of a looser and more diffuse hierarchical structure, delegated and discretionary authority in which the top provided only vague and general guidelines, giving wide latitude to the lower downs, all the way to the bottom, to decide who was and who was not an enemy and what to do with them. These lower downs were certainly not just following orders." Would you agree with this characterization by Steve Hedder?
Yes, I would.
I'm sorry, maybe I should have asked a different question first. Are you familiar with this article that may inform our understanding today?
Yes, I am.
And the second excerpt I would like to show you from the same article is on page 21. And the English ERN for that page is 00661475. And I will quote, "It seems that most commonly, however, people arrested in villages were sent to district security for interrogation, and although the district answered to the sector secretary, most prisoners were sooner or later executed on the authority of the district itself. This reflected the reality that zone and sector secretaries often merely passed on the general instructions from above to local cadre down to the district level, but paid little attention to whether they were doing what they were supposed to do or not." Mr. Chandler, Professor Chandler, would you agree with this characterization by Steve Hedder?
Yes, I would.
And then on page 2, Steve Hedder discusses the historical and legal model relating to the genocide committed by the Nazis. And he discusses this model and he writes, "In short, the historical and legal model is a top-down conspiracy to commit genocide and other crimes against humanity. It targets, first of all, the big fish who are presumed to be overwhelmingly responsible for most, if not all, of these crimes committed while they were in power." And that's the end of the quote for now. But let me ask you, well, at this point, does this characterization by Steve Hedder of the historical and legal model relating to the Nazi genocide, does that remind you of the dominant narrative that we discussed earlier this morning, the dominant narrative relating to the DK regime?
Yes, it does, but with a slight qualification. I think, this again I'm stating an opinion, but you've got to accept the idea that the top people were ultimately responsible for what is happening because they were in charge of the country. Overwhelmingly, I think in this case is a word I wouldn't, if I didn't write this passage, I wouldn't have used overwhelmingly, but yes, it reminds me of the other. Your question is quite good, quite clear. I mean,
and as a historian, let me rephrase that. are you satisfied that enough historical research has been conducted as to the responsibility of people in the DK regime that were at a lower status than, let's say, the Central or Standing Committee? Let me phrase the question like this at first. Sorry, I meant to say that I had phrased the question as such. Are you satisfied that, from a historical perspective, that enough scholarly research has been done with regard to the responsibility of people lower than top echelon leaders of the DK regime?
Well, in a sense, I'm never sure of what's enough. And here is an area I don't really want to venture into, because it seems to me that a great deal of the research that's been done recently on this issue was in connection with cases that are not being tried, or going to be, perhaps, I don't know, that are cases beyond the case under discussion. So, I mean, enough if it's not for me to enter into the business of the court, but let's just assume that this case, these other cases will go forward. Then you will have more research, and in some case you might reach what would be considered by, say, the prosecution enough for an indictment. But if the case, this kind of research is impossible to carry out without some sort of mandate. You can't wander into the countryside and find this material out. So we have a lot of material on these lower down activities and lower down behavior. A lot of it is not able to be discussed here. A lot of it's not open to scrutiny. And so from an independent historian's point of view, I say, no, it's not enough because it's not in the open record. But it's a lot more is known about this behavior now than was known when I was writing my own books. And that's why I was agreeing earlier with these Steve Hedder's statements, which are drawn from his own very extensive research long before he had anything to do with the tribunal. So he made those conclusions early on the basis of extensive research. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Professor Chamberlain. Just to be absolutely clear, I don't ask you to opine on anything that relates to the tribunal as such. I am asking you for your opinions as a historian. And something that you just mentioned attracted my attention, and I would like to ask something more about this. You state that this information that you might be looking at is not something that is part of an open record, if I wrote down your words correctly. Could you elaborate on that for us?
Not really. A lot of this stuff is draft material that I've seen that has not yet been published, but it's not classified by any authority. So I can't elaborate that much further for that. There is certainly ample material at the archives of DCCAM that point toward these activities also, if one were to do sustained research in there. A problem, of course, that arises, as you see from the footnotes to Hedder's work, is that a great deal of this organizational information comes out of confessions. And I know that he has argued, told me anyway, I'm not sure where he wrote it down, that he feels strongly that this organizational material deserves to be included as in official documents, because you find out who was in command of places. That's verifiable information that you could finally dig up. But, it's not... I'll stop there.
And I understand you don't want to speculate on Steve Hedder's research, so I will not ask you to, but has Steve Hedder told you, or do you have any other reasons to believe, to know where this organizational material that Steve Hedder speaks about is located?
Well, it's located, I just mentioned, it's located primarily in Confessions of Tuol Sleng. This is where the information has been drawn. If you look at his footnotes, this is where he's got his material, plus from extensive interviews, 2 places.
But are you familiar, are you aware of any research that Steve Hedder has conducted into this topic after publication of this paper?
Not specifically. I've read his published material. I have not. I've read some unpublished material, but not much. I can't. That's my answer to that.
In that same Steve Hedder article on page 2, I will, if it can be shown on the screen again, it's again the article by Steve Hedder that we were discussing earlier. And I quote Steve Hedder document. This chapter argues that this approach has misappropriately dominated historical and legal approaches to the massive murders committed in democratic Cambodia under the rule from 17 April 1975 to 7 January 1979 of the Communist Party of Cambodia, and efforts to bring those responsible for these murders to justice. The only single-volume history of DK, Ben Kiernan's recently republished The Pol Pot Regime, Race, Power, and Genocide in Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge, strains to make the DK case analogous to a totalitarian and intentionalist and thus implicitly Nazi-like genocide. He advocates that Pol Pot and his leading associates should be held accountable for CPK crimes, which he say resulted from an explosive combination of totalitarian political ambition and a racialist project of ethnic purification, but does not mention accountability for lower downs. And I think you partly answered this question already in your earlier comments, but Steve Hedder takes issue with this failure of this, let's say, the omission by Ben Kiernan of accountability for lower downs in his volume, The Pol Pot Regime. Do you share Steve Hedder's view that that is an important omission if one wants to understand the DK regime?
Three-word answer is yes, I do, but it's a complicated question and one that we have to expand out into other areas, but certainly what you're hearing here in the Kiernan book, and one of the reasons I took a little bit of issue with it when I reviewed it, was that making racism the essence of the entire regime as opposed to aspects of certain periods in the regime seemed to me a bit of a stretch, and this is why Hedder uses the word strains. And I think he's trying to move back into something that an indictment, an informal indictment, a historical indictment, not very far different from the one raised at the 1979 trial, which doesn't seem to me to be a fair, an accurate assessment of what went on under DK, unless you're talking about the single man at the top is in fact, not overwhelmingly responsible, as I said before, but ultimately responsible. Well, that doesn't get you very far in terms of studying what's happening. So I think this paragraph of headers is quite justified.
You are an historian, and we've been speaking about context several times today. And my question to you is, do you think that events and political realities that have occurred after the fall of the DK regime color or influence the way we look at the quote-unquote facts of this case today?
I think that's inevitable. That's the way people operate. I mean, we're operating in terms of the testimony of last week. I mean, we benefited from that. We have a different, I think, maybe context today than we had on last Wednesday. But I'm not boasting that this is clear. I'm not saying that, but it's just this is how people operate with the information they have. And as you go on, once a regime has fallen, information becomes available that was not available before. This is a very secretive regime. You have to be very cautious in sorting out the information you get, looking out for easy exits like the Pol Pot Young-Sri genocidal clique, or exits that suggest that the top officials knew nothing about this, so therefore they shouldn't be here. But as time goes on, and one wishes in a way that we were 10 years ago when information was fresher, but as time goes on, you find out more and more detail that encourages us to make more nuanced judgments. And this is, I think, what makes history an evolving thing. You can't write the last word. I could say I've written my last book, but that's not the last word. That'll be by somebody else.
I think that makes a lot of sense, Professor Chandler. And in that context, could you elaborate a little bit on the political coloring of the party that took over power after 1979, and how that political coloring may have dominated the dominant narrative that we have been discussing? And I'm asking you this as a historian and not as a legal scholar, obviously.
The President, Professor Chandler, could you please hold on? Wait until we hear the words from the prosecution and co-lawyers for the civil party first. Co-prosecutor, you may proceed first.
Your Honours, we would object to this question, political colouring or otherwise, by regimes subsequent to the DK is not relevant for the purposes of Professor Chandler's testimony. What we're interested in is Professor Chandler's expert opinion on the events and authority structures of 75 to 79.
The President, counsel for the civil party, you may now proceed.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. Not only is this a leading question, but it is out of context, because it is situated during the period after 1979. And if we are referring to the experience of a historian, that means referring to documents that are dated after 1979.
To respond to that, Mr. President, there was a reason why I asked the professor first whether he was of the opinion that events that took place after the fall of the DK regime could influence the way we perceive facts at this moment, and the professor has answered from a historical perspective, yes, they can, if I may paraphrase the professor, and he can correct me if I'm wrong. We're talking here about the facts of this case. We have heard earlier today and last week testimony of the culling of evidence by the Vietnamese. The PRK regime may or may not have been involved. This is implicit in the question, this may or may not have been a result of the political coloring of the PRK regime and its history. And Professor Chandler is an expert on the history of Cambodia. He knows a whole lot about the history of the CPK. And I would like to have Professor Chandler's historical opinion, no more than that, on how or whether or not he is of the opinion that these facts have been colored by the later regime that was put in place or took over power, depending on who you ask, after the DK regime fell. So I think it's clearly relevant. It relates to history, and we are here to ask Professor Chandler to explain Cambodian history to us. And I think I, for sure, need some.
The President. Counsel for the civil parties, you are not allowed to reply to the statement by the other party. The chamber now rules that the statements by both the prosecutor and the civil party sustained. The objection is sustained, and indeed the question should not be responded by the witness. Counsel Michael Canawas, you may now proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, Mr. President. Good morning, Your Honors, and good morning to everyone in and around the courtroom. I just wish to supplement that if the dominant narrative that has emerged as a result of the coloring and may have impacted on the way certain witnesses may have provided evidence of.
The President, Counsel has, the Chamber has already ruled upon this. You are not allowed to touch upon this. If you have other matter to raise, you may proceed. Now we proceed to Counsel for Mr. Nunchi to continue with the questions.
If I may, just 1 second, Mr. President. I was merely.
The President, the Chamber will not allow you to dwell on the same matter because it has already been ruled. You are not allowed to talk on the same topic. In the interest of time, we shall now proceed to other counsel.
I'm not trying to dwell on the topic. I'm trying to bring to your attention and to your colleagues' attention that we have the right to make a record. We're not one group here. I represent a different.
The President, indeed, you can have the floor and make such statement when the time
allocated to your counsel arrives. Counsel for Mr. Nguyen Chia, you may now proceed with a few more questions before we adjourn for lunch break.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I respect your ruling that I'm not allowed to ask the question I just posed, but I would like to have a reasoned decision on the objections by the prosecution and the civil parties, because, again, for record-keeping purposes, we need to know what the reasons are for your decision to not allow this question. So it will also help me to formulate my next round of questions. So if you could be of assistance.
The President, the Chamber has already ruled on this, and the objection by both the co-prosecutor and counsel for the civil parties sustained, and your question is not in the scope of the fact, and that they are not supported by any evidence, and you have failed to pinpoint to any actual evidentiary documents to support your question, and the Chamber has ruled already on this.
That makes it clearer, Mr. President. Thank you. That also helps me to formulate my next question. Reference to, what I would say, pinpointing and referring to specific documents. Professor Chandler, you, when you spoke about the culling, you spoke about Vietnam's reasons for doing so. As we discussed, the PRK officials may or may not have been involved on this. You were not entirely clear. But my question to you is, do you think that the culling of the evidence that has come out of the DK regime was influenced by the political coloring of the PRK?
Your Honours, we would have...
The President, indeed, Mr. Co-Prosecutor, you may proceed.
First of all, the culling is speculative. It's an assumption the Professor's made. But secondly, to ask then for an interpretation of how a speculated event might have taken place is completely is not appropriate, and it also is beyond the scope of relevance of Professor Chandler's testimony.
The President, thank you. Counsel for the civil parties, you may now proceed.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. My learned friend is insisting his question has to do with acts that are presumed to have been committed after 1979, and he qualifies them as destruction of evidence without any certainty, and that the documents destroyed were evidence. So we are again talking of an assumption here, which is made by my learned friend. Thank you.
In response to my colleague from the Office of the Co-Prosecutors, Professor Chandler, in his opinion, is speculating about the culling. I would submit that that is a way to describe Professor Chandler's testimony, but I think we could then describe most of his testimony as speculation. But I would like to point out, and I think Professor Chandler was very careful to point out, that he has objective indications to assume that these confessions were culled. There are Vietnamese notes on the confessions that were found in S21. So he is not speculating. He is delivering an informed opinion on this matter, just as he has been doing throughout his testimony. And another thing I think is important when we look at the knowledge of Professor Chandler on this issue. Professor Chandler has done very early research into DK-era documents. He has spoken to very many people, partly people that were involved in the original collection, partly people that have been involved in later collection of documents. So he can form reasoned opinion on the question I just posed. As to respond to my colleague from the civil parties, colleague from the civil parties states that I'm asking questions about facts that predate or that are after the DK period. Just for the record, we are talking here about documents that come from the DK period. They are, at least according to Professor Chandler and several other people that, for example, DC Cam, stem from the DK period, and that's what my question relates to. The fact that it is dated slightly later than January 1979 does not change that fact. And I'm not talking necessarily about just the evidence that is being used in this trial, which is in this way possibly culled or manipulated or destroyed, whatever name you want to put on it. But I'm also talking about the historical sources that Professor Chandler and other historians has had to rely on. So it's clearly a historical question, and Professor Chandler is totally capable of providing us a reasoned and balanced opinion on this matter.
President, after deliberation, the Chamber notes that to be precise on this, the expert should respond to the current question put by counsel for Nuon Chea, and as an historian on history of Cambodia, the witness may be in the position to respond to this. And at the same time, the Chamber rules that the objections by the co-prosecutor and counsel for the civil party is not sustained. So, witness, you may now proceed to respond to that question.
I certainly do. I think maybe, it's my own view, I think maybe too much is being made of this whole culling issue, which is extremely speculative. I would not base any deep research on it. The scattered evidence suggests that it occurred. I'm reminded of an exchange that some of you may remember my testimony in the case one, when the lawyers for asked me what material was in the undiscovered archives. I had to reply that it was difficult to tell what material was in the undiscovered archives. I'd be as polite as I could. Same thing here. We don't know where these documents went. We don't know which documents disappeared. We don't know what was in them. We don't know why, if they were culled, they were culled. I think we can make a supposition that as the Vietnamese obviously went through many of the materials at S-21 and probably other materials, so we don't know that for sure, they took out some materials that did not seem to them to meet their interests at the time. So much material survived about the DK regime that we are able here to speak with some documentary authority. I don't want to get into the culling issue too deeply. I think there's evidence of it, but what was we don't know if some things were removed, burnt by the DK people themselves, disappeared and are took away and are locked up somewhere. I can't answer these questions. So I don't know where the questions are going to go, and I of course am here to answer questions, but I'm not prepared to go in much further into this issue.
The President. Thank you very much, Professor Chandler, and thank you, counsels. Since it is now appropriate time for lunch adjournment, the court will adjourn for a while, and the next session will be resumed by 1:30. The court officer is now instructed to ensure that Professor Chandler be well accommodated during lunch break, and that he be returned to the courtroom by 1:30. Counsel for Nuon Chea, you're still on your feet. You may now proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just want to tell you that Nuon Chea would like to follow this afternoon's proceedings from his holding cell. He is suffering from a headache, back pain, and he has problems concentrating. So we have the waiver prepared. You agree?
President, the Chamber notes the request of Nuon Chea made through his counsel, asking the Chamber to allow him to observe the proceedings from his holding cell due to the fact that he has some headache, back pain, and trouble concentrating. Counsel has already made it clear that the waiver would be produced before the Chamber shortly. The Chamber therefore grant such request. Nuon Chea can now observe the proceedings from the holding cell for the remainder of the day. Mr. Nuon Chea has already made it expressly clear that he has waived his right to directly participate in the courtroom. The Chamber therefore asks that counsel produce this waiver signed or given thumbprint by Mr. Nguyen Chia immediately to the chamber. Mr. Nguyen Chia can now be taken to the holding cells where he can observe the proceedings. From there, security personnel are now instructed to bring the accused persons to the holding cell and bring Khieu Samphan back to the courtroom by leaving Mr. Nguyen Chia in his holding cell to observe the proceedings. From there, the court is now adjourned.